What is up, everybody? Happy Thanksgiving weekend. We are back with FTN NBA Live presented by Superdraft. Adam Pfeifer here, and joining me, first time working together, I believe. So excited about this is Mr. Alex Blickle. Alex, what's up, man? How was your holiday? Got a 7-game slate, I believe, and I believe there's a game on right now. So we got plenty of basketball action, and we got some college football. How's your weekend going?
Yeah, solid Thanksgiving. Good weekend, hopefully. And my Sixers are going right now, and then a nice 7-game slate. So exciting night.
Yeah, Embiid back, Tobias back, starting to look a little bit normal in Philadelphia. So yeah, we have 7 games on the main slate. We're gonna go position by position, kind of just break down, who stands out. There's been some players ruled out since throughout the afternoon, so we'll talk about that. And before we get started, I mean, we got the weekend here. This is the time, right? Black Friday, massive deal week and weekend. And at FTN, we have a great promo code going on for just this weekend. You get 40% off any package at FTN Fantasy, FTN Daily, FTN Bets, any package. 40% off. All you got to do, use the promo code Black Friday. Again, that ends this weekend. It's only this weekend only, so it's not too late. Check that out. You get 40% off any package. Alex, so let's start with the point guard position here. We got, a lot of spend up options, right? Luka Doncic, James Harden, LaMelo Ball, Trae Young. Then there's some interesting, players down below because we have some players out, like both top point guards from New York are out, and Derrick Rose and Kemba Walker. Cole Anthony's going to miss his 5th straight game for the Magic. Spencer Dinwiddie's out for Washington. So at the high end, what kind of stands out to you here on the slate at point guard?
Yeah, I think point guard might be the most loaded position tonight. I think both Kevin Porter Jr. and Emmanuel Quickly really stand out to me. Porter Jr. is somebody who popped in Kyle's player rater, and he's also in the best game environment of the night, highest pace at projected 107, which is pretty awesome. We don't get many 107 games, and that's sort of what that's the type of environment in which Porter Jr. is his best self. And then obviously Quickly at just 4,300 without Rose and Kemba. That's such a great spot for him. And I think it's not just about the extra minutes for him, but it's also the fact, normally he's sharing the court with Derrick Rose, and Rose hogs a lot of the usage. If he still gets some second unit run, it'll be his second unit this time around. So it's a minutes boost for sure, and then potentially a usage boost as well for him. So at a standard fantasy point per minute ratio of around 0.9, if that goes up at all with his minutes, I mean, he's a smash play.
Yeah, and on the season, his usage rate's around 22% with both Rose and Walker off the floor, and he's well over a fantasy point per minute. So, and this was a guy last year, there was a lot of, in the beginning of the season when he was playing a ton of minutes and was posting huge numbers, and then his playing time went down. But when he was on the floor last year in his rookie year, he was a pretty high usage player. So this should be a good spot for him. And then let's go to the Orlando situation, right? I mean, Cole Anthony, he's missed 4 straight. This will be his 5th, and we've seen Jalen Suggs over the last handful of games start to be more consistent. He was a little bit underwhelming for a lot of the beginning of his rookie season, but with Anthony out, who is among the league leaders in touches per game and average seconds per touch, Suggs has gotten a big bump. I think his usage rate's around 28% with Anthony off the floor this season. And in the last 4 games he's missed, that's been over 31%. Is Orlando sticking out to you any more than they have been in the 4 games since Cole Anthony's been out?
This is actually potentially their toughest game environment. We don't really think about Cleveland being a tough matchup, but Cleveland has actually been quite good defensively this year, and they're one of the slower teams as well. So I don't necessarily love this spot for Suggs. I think the usage should certainly be there, but it's also a little bit concerning that in these games he's played 25, 17, 30, and 26 minutes. Now, a lot of that has been blowout related, but they're a really bad team, and they're even worse without Anthony. So it's not like we can confidently say they won't be blown out tonight. And then the other aspect to that is against Milwaukee in the second game when he only played 17 minutes, that wasn't just blowout related. That was also that they were playing RJ Hampton over him. So it's a little bit murky for me at 5,400 with him, with this position as a whole being so loaded. So I think like in a vacuum, Suggs makes sense, but on this slate, I'm not really that interested.
Yeah, I tend to agree, especially with Quickly being cheaper, and like we just got word that it looks like Tyler Hero is going to be questionable. If that led to him being out, I mean, Kyle Lowry would become a lot more interesting, obviously, on top of Jimmy Butler as well. Let's go back to the high end real quick because, like I said, you have Luka, Harden, and LaMelo. You can throw in Trae Young as the top four. You mentioned the environment in that Charlotte Houston game, and I agree. Like that makes LaMelo so interesting. Both those teams top three in pace. LaMelo, I talk about this a lot, like with him and with Rozier and with Miles Bridges, like when they get out in transition, they are very tough to stop. And the Rockets are allowing the most points per game in transition. They're bottom 5 in points per possession allowed. Like this was last year too. So this sets up really well for LaMelo Ball. But I also think it sets up really well for Terry Rozier, who definitely won't be as popular. Point guard, shooting guard eligibility, but I think he's really viable too. He's 13th in the league in transition points per game at just under 5. And now that he's back, you look at the competitive games Charlotte's played, he's playing 32 to 35 minutes. Now, Houston, Charlotte, I think last time I looked, 6-7 point road favorites here. Could Charlotte get ahead in this game and pull away? Sure, but if they don't, I mean, at 6,700, I like Rozier a lot, and then obviously LaMelo Ball, the ceiling is massive in pretty much any game, but especially in a game environment like this.
Yeah, LaMelo is one of those guys who really specializes in pace. He's got 5 category contribution and triple-double upside. The last really big pace-up spot for them was in LA against the Lakers. He played 42 minutes that game, but 25, 16, and 11. I mean, that's the type of upside he has in this kind of environment. So I absolutely love him at 10-4. I feel like DraftKings has been really consistent this year, sort of pricing up the studs almost to the point where they are all overpriced. And LaMelo feels like he's actually fairly priced, which is, like I said, these days that's pretty unique. That's actually a great spot for him. So especially because he has shooting guard eligibility, he's one of my favorite plays on the slate, and it's definitely my favorite pay up option.
So you prefer LaMelo over Harden and Luka and Trae?
Yeah, I mean, if LaMelo, Harden, and Luka were comparable price-wise, it'd be a much tougher decision. I still might lean to him just because of the game environment and the correlation of a game stack, which I'm definitely targeting. But given the fact that he's about $1,000 cheaper than those two, it's pretty much no contest for me.
Yeah, and the other thing about LaMelo is in the start of the season, he was playing max like 30, 32 minutes because Ish Smith was getting a lot of run, and that just, Charlotte finally decided, okay, this guy's unbelievable. Let's play him 36, 37 minutes in close games. Now, the last couple hasn't played that many minutes. One was a blowout. The other one he got in a little bit of foul trouble against Orlando. And I will say, like, LaMelo is actually one of the point guards that you look up at, it's 7:45 or 20 minutes, 15 minutes after the game starts, and you say, oh, he's got 3 fouls. Like, he's one of those point guards, but you don't try to project that, and I think it's a really nice spot for him. Let's keep going down. I mean, you have Chris Paul at 8K. Phoenix is won 15 in a row. He's kind of giving you that floor each night. Donovan Mitchell is interesting at 8,100 coming off a down game against the Pelicans. They play the Pelicans again tonight. Now, again, the spread in Utah is massive, but we saw the Pelicans. Yeah, they were at home, but they won this game and kept it tight. Maybe they do it again. That's going to be crucial for Donovan Mitchell, who shot 6 of 21. Like, the shot volume is always going to be there, and the matchup's good, and the price is pretty cheap for him. And we know he has 50, 60 point upside. These like point guards in the 8K range and a little bit lower, Mitchell, Chris Paul, Garland, I wrote up about today about his touches per game since Sexton's been out of the lineup are massive, and his usage rate's around 29%. And then I mentioned Kyle Lowry if Tyler Hero's out. Does anybody stand out in that group?
I think from a price standpoint and a projection standpoint, Mitchell's definitely a nice play. I know Mitchell was pretty high up there on Kyle's player rater. My only concern there is I believe they're 13-point favorites. At least they were earlier in the day. So there's definite blowout risk there, especially if Mitchell were to get hot from 3. So I think if you're going to play Mitchell, you'd like to bring it back with somebody. And I don't really like anyone on New Orleans, so I'm not really interested in Mitchell myself. But I would say I think you definitely nailed it that if Hero was out, Lowry would be my favorite of this group. And then I also am a fan of Garland. I think one of the favorite stats that I've come across the last week or so of research is the fact that Garland and Rubio are both averaging about 13.5 potential assists per game. And Colin Sexton was just under 6 potential assists per game. So I think that just makes Cleveland a much more attractive team to look to use a lot of their guys and almost stack, especially because, if these guys are getting assists, it means there's a lot of positive correlation between their guys. And so I think whether it's Jared Allen, Evan Mobley, or Lauri Markkanen, all three of those guys pair really well with either of these point guards. So I really like that team as a whole right now.
Yeah, and Mobley is available to play tonight. So he was supposed to miss 2 to 3 weeks, and he's only going to end up missing 4 games. But it's a great point. Like, I'm a Cavs fan. Like, Sexton's an awesome scorer, but the offense flows more because he's a guy that gets out in transition and just looks to push it or ISOs. And Garland, yeah, he's been way more aggressive offensively. I think he's averaging just over 19 field goal attempts per game since Sexton went out, but he's also, like you said, facilitating a lot. And Jared Allen and Evan Mobley are both averaging, over 2.5 points per game as the roll man and pick and roll. So like you said, they do correlate. I have no problem with Garland. I think you've seen the floor for him. It's been really high. What about, we talked about quickly, RJ Barrett has point guard eligibility. They've played him at point in time at times, and in close games, he's definitely playing 35, 36 minutes. Maybe he gets more run at point guard. Barrett's been a guy that I haven't looked to a lot in DFS because his ceiling is pretty capped. It's been capped over his first couple seasons in the NBA in terms of fantasy, but if he has to handle the ball more with both Kemba and Derrick Rose out, 6,200 is like, at that price against Atlanta, like, he's fine regardless. The floor is going to be there, but now you have to start considering, okay, is there a potential ceiling this time around given the state of the point guards in New York?
Yeah, he is interesting. I looked at him a lot. I think one thing to note is it's not like Kemba has had this major usage rate for them, so I don't think there's a ton of usage that's voided with him being out. So I don't love that for Barrett. And then the second thing is I almost expect them to go to Randall as a makeshift point guard before they would go to Barrett, just because Barrett is going to be facing other perimeter defenders, whereas Randall's going to be bringing the ball up against a guy who's not used to playing that type of defense. That's why we see a lot of teams going towards that like point forward role with a lot of guys. Golden State has been doing that for years with Draymond Green. So I don't necessarily think this is a huge boost for Barrett, but it's definitely within the range of outcomes that he does facilitate a lot more tonight and has a really nice game.
Yeah, because that would be massive for him if he could get some more peripherals. But it's a good call on Randall too, because he's been even like, that's why I loved Randall coming out of college. Like, the guy, he just grabs defensive rebounds and pushes the floor, and I don't expect that to change tonight. Keep scrolling down. I mentioned Spencer Dinwiddie's going to rest. The last time he rested, Aaron Holiday got the start, not Raul Neto. Any interest in either one of those two for value? Holiday, I believe, played like 24 minutes in that game he last started. He started, I think, 5 games this year. He's averaging 28 minutes per game, but the fantasy numbers aren't great. 6 points, about 2 rebounds and 2 assists per game. Neto's been better in fantasy because he can facilitate. Or is this a spot where you say, you know what, don't get cute, let's just play Bradley Beal then, who's been, I feel like he's been a little bit underwhelming in fantasy this year, but still, rock solid.
Yeah, it's one of those positions, I think, where if there was a little bit more certainty, there would be more viable plays there. Like, either Holiday or Neto would be kind of a nice value if we could be confident about their minutes, but we can't between them. And it's not just about which one of them plays. Like you mentioned, it's also a spot where they could just use Beal as the facilitator and the default point guard, if you will. So I don't love either of those guys' values. I think it's another situation where I'd point to just the fact that point guard is loaded. So why go to an uncertain value when we have really, really high probability plays at the position?
Yeah, totally fair. Anybody else at point guard before we move on to shooting guard?
No, I think that's it for me.
All right, let's go to shooting guard. You have Zach LaVine, Bradley Beal, like we mentioned, Devin Booker. He's coming off, I think back-to-back really strong games as Phoenix continues to roll. That Brooklyn game is pretty enticing too, because when I was writing about it this morning, I think it was Brooklyn at home, 1-point favorites, total around 224, 225. So it's not quite Charlotte-Houston, but it's pretty enticing for fantasy as well. Donovan Mitchell, who stands out to you at shooting guard? And again, there'll be some overlap because a lot of players are point guard, shooting guard eligible, like I mentioned with Terry Rozier, Donovan Mitchell. But who stands out to you in terms of shooting guard that we haven't touched on at point guard?
Yeah, I mean LaMelo's my guy at shooting guard, and I think on most slates I'm only going to be using one shooting guard because it's almost always one of the weaker positions, and I think tonight is no different. But if you're not into LaMelo, I do think it's worth talking about Devin Booker for a little bit. As you just mentioned, that is a nice game environment, small pace boost for both teams, and I think Booker is benefiting from the extra campaign run that we're seeing that's really limiting Chris Paul's minutes kind of into the 30 or even low 30s range. Whereas Booker has gotten to 39 against Cleveland. He's pretty much staying in the mid to upper 30s. And just those extra handful of minutes where he's on the floor as the lone guy, the clear number one, and instead of sharing that number one duty with Paul, seems to be really helping him. And I think that makes a ton of sense. And so in a nice game environment, I do think Booker is a solid play and is definitely my second favorite pay-up option at the position.
Yeah, it's a good point because we saw when Chris Paul joined Phoenix, Booker, who's it's not like he's always been this like 8 to 10 assist player, but because there was really no other ball handlers for the majority of his career in Phoenix, he would just walk into like 6 assists and 7 assists.
Yeah.
But then Chris Paul took that away a lot, and his floor was a lot lower, and his ceiling was a lot lower last year. But when Paul's off the floor this season, he's got a 16% assist rate, which isn't bad. It drops to like 12 or 13% when he's sharing the floor with Chris Paul. So definitely helps Booker if he's playing more minutes than Chris Paul and getting more time as the primary ball handler. Again, mention Mitchell. If that game can stay close, there's a lot of ceiling, but you would feel like running it back. I agree. You would feel better about running it back with someone from the Pelicans. And then, like you said, like I agree, shooting guard, it tends to be one of the weaker positions. Like Zach LaVine is fine, but like Vucevic is back, probably takes away a little bit of the appeal on him. Going down, like Brandon Ingram is shooting guard only on DraftKings, which I was a little bit surprised about. I mean, again, just you love the volume and everything, but he hasn't even reached 40 fantasy points in 7 games in a row now. And now he's got Utah, again, second or home and home, tough spot for him. Not really standing out to me. Chetty Osman, you can't play at that price given the fact that Cleveland's healthier with Mobley back and Markkanen back and Kevin Love back. It's tough. I mean, we mentioned Jalen Suggs. If you landed on Jalen Suggs with Anthony out, I don't think it's the worst option. But it's tough. I mean, you got to keep scrolling down. Like maybe you can start talking about in the 4,700 range, Evan Fournier with both Kemba and Rose out. Eric Gordon with Jalen Green out. I mean, he's going to play 30 to 32 minutes probably. Good game environment, but like we know with Eric Gordon, if his shot's not falling, he's probably not going to get you much. Do any of those two stand out or anybody low? Like Kevin Huerter has kind of been popping in the value article the last couple of days, but like Bogdanovich has been questionable like each of the last like 5 games ends up playing. I believe he's questionable again tonight. So I kind of expect him to play at this point, but anybody stand out there?
I think you nailed it. First of all, on Levine and Ingram, they seem to be priced sort of at their ceiling because they both run into the same problem, which is their peripheral stats are very low. So in order for them to have a ceiling game, it has to come from scoring and extra volume. And particularly Levine is just having a really tough time getting that spike usage and that scoring explosion because of the team he plays on, how many weapons they do have. And Ingram just has been ineffective and on a team that's struggling to score. And it's too easy for opposing defenses to kind of key on him. And he just doesn't have the all-around game where he can take advantage of that. And so they're able to defend him in a pretty easy way, I think is what we're seeing for them. I do think there are a couple guys sort of in the value mid-tier range. Alec Burks and Mikhail Bridges both stand out to me. Bridges, again, we talked about that game environment being the second best on the slate. And Bridges is definitely somebody who thrives in pace. We have this projected at 103, easily the second fastest on the slate. There isn't a third game above 98. And we've also seen him play mid to upper 30s, especially in competitive games. So we could see like 38 minutes from Bridges tonight. So at 5,200, I think he is a really nice value. And then I think Alec Burks is somebody who he could be a very nice play here if he gets some of the voided guard run. It's possible that the Knicks could just slide down Barrett and slide everybody down and Burks plays his typical role, or maybe they give Burks a lot more runs and suddenly he's getting 30 minutes and we know he's a good fantasy point per minute producer. So I feel like, Burks has a really wide range of outcomes. It makes him a really, really good GPP play because he could play 20 minutes, he could play low 30s. And if he's only playing 20, he's got severe dud risk. And if he's playing the low 30s, he could be the GPP winner on the slate.
Yeah, those are both fantastic calls. Burks, wherever he's been, has been a really high usage player, and his usage rate climbs by nearly 4% with Walker and Rose off the floor. Fournier, who I mentioned, is a plus 6%. So they're both viable. You feel better about Fournier's minutes for sure, but like if they play close to the same minutes somehow, like Burks could easily outscore Fournier. It's not, it wouldn't shock me at all.
Yeah.
And then on Bridges, he's already locked in the really strong minutes anyway, but when you're facing James Hart and Kevin Durant and you have Mikhail Bridges, who's one of the elite wing defenders in basketball, you're probably going to walk into some extra minutes in this game regardless for your defensive abilities in that game. So I think that's a great call. I'll add one more player. It's more so the game environment, but his minutes have actually been pretty solid. If you're looking for value, Cody Martin at 4,200 for Charlotte. He's played at least 27 minutes in 7 straight games. He's played at least 28 in 3 straight. Production is not amazing. It's been solid though. He's been 20, 31, 27, 27 fantasy points. Not the worst option. But again, like if I find myself, if I'm looking at playing a quote unquote shooting guard, I'm probably just going to play a lot of the players that are dual eligible, right? Darius Garland, point guard, shooting guard. LaMelo Ball, point guard, shooting guard. So if you don't have anybody else, I think we can move on to small forward.
I would just add, it's interesting you say Martin, because I was also thinking Kelly Oubre Jr. might be a nice value at 4,600.
Sure.
He's been playing a decent amount. He's definitely somebody who thrives in pace. Biggest concern there is, does PJ Washington's return start to eat into his minutes? I think it will some nights, and other nights it won't. And so
maybe that cancels it out with Plumlee back, or Plumlee out, which maybe just
that's probably true. That's probably true.
Which would help Oubre, and Oubre's been getting, like, his usage has been ridiculous off the bench for them. So, all right, let's go to small forward, as it very often is, led by Kevin Durant, 10,800 on DraftKings against Phoenix. We talked about that game, kind of sneakily really enticing for fantasy. Jimmy Butler, I want to talk about. Obviously, he gets a bump if Tyler Hero ends up sitting. It looks like he's going to be a game time decision. Jalen Brunson, by the way, just got ruled out for Dallas, so we can touch on that, I guess. But Jimmy Butler's he's not a 3-point shooter necessarily. He lives in the mid range and the free throw line distance and in. But I was writing the preview today. He's top 7 or 8 in post up scoring points per game. He's been posting up a lot. And Chicago's actually allowing the most points per game to the post. And like I already had interest in Butler in that aspect. Plus the floor is always high for him. But if Tyler Hero's out, I mean, where does Butler rank for you on the slate? Given the fact that the floor is always there, and maybe we get more of a ceiling if Hero's out, because Hero, he's been fantastic this year, and he's taking a lot of ball handling duty as well.
Yeah, I think for me to be interested in Butler, Hero has to be out. And then I definitely would be interested. 9,700 is a steep price to pay for him. And especially because Chicago has a 13.2% turnover rate. That's really low. And obviously, like, Butler's ceiling is tied to the steal and block upside that he has. So against a low turnover team, I don't love that spot for him. But the usage without Hero, I think, probably makes up for that and makes him a nice play.
Anybody else you want to talk about that stands out at the small forward position? Like I mentioned, Durant, Levine, small forward eligible. We've been talking about the Charlotte-Houston game. There's Miles Bridges, who just kind of keep waiting for him to come back down to earth, and it's been a little bit more inconsistent, but he's still playing really well. And I talk about, like, this game environment is literally perfect for Miles Bridges. He's among the league leaders in, like, efficiency in transition, frequency rate in transition, and like I said, Houston plays fast. They allow the most points per game in transition, so would I be shocked if we had one of those, 45, 50-point fantasy games for Miles Bridges? Absolutely not. And he correlates pretty well with LaMelo, too.
Yeah, really well with LaMelo. And I think a lot of that is just because they both thrive in pace. So I love Bridges at 7,900. And also the fact that, like you mentioned, Plumlee's absence, that should be really, really good for Bridges' rebounding upside. They've played a lot of small ball lineups with him as the de facto center. So even though I think, like, I too was kind of waiting for his production to come back down to earth, I don't think it's in this type of environment, and I don't think it's when he's playing a lot of small ball center. So I love him at his price. And then same game, I really like Jayshawn Tate, another guy who is is a pace specialist, if you will. And, he's a 5-point or 5 category contributor. So I don't love the minutes that we're seeing, and they're sort of inconsistent. But this is the type of game where he could play really well, and when he plays well, he earns himself more minutes. And so I really love his ceiling at 4,600 in this environment.
Yeah. Bridges, by the way, you mentioned the rebounding without Plumlee. His rebounding rate jumps up to 23% when Plumlee's off the floor. That is a very healthy number, so that's a great spot for him. Gordon Hayward, if you want exposure to that game, doesn't have quite the ceiling, but the floor is pretty solid for him. He's 6,500, should play. I mean, look, his minutes have been down the last 2, but again, one was a blowout. In more competitive games, he's been around that 33-minute mark or so. So I think he's perfectly fine. RJ Barrett, I think, definitely a spot where you prefer to play Barrett at small forward, given how loaded point guard is, if you want to play him. And then there's like Kyle Kuzma with Dinwiddie out, like maybe gets a bump. Dinwiddie was being maxed at like 30 minutes, so like it's not like he was playing massive minutes. He is a ball handler, a relatively high usage player. And look, Kuzma's been pretty productive in his first season in Washington, especially on the glass. I mean, double-digit rebounds for Kuzma in 6 of his last 10 games. And that hasn't really been an outlier. Like, he's averaging just over 9 boards per game on the season. 6,100, the price has come down after a solid game with Dinwiddie out. What do you think of him? And then, like some of the Dallas guys, like Tim Hardaway. Does anybody get a bump for Dallas? I mean, Hardaway Jr.'s minutes have been massive the last couple games. Brunson being out, I'm sure it doesn't hurt, but like at the end of the day, when you're playing with Luka, you're still, unless you're hitting every shot you get when you're getting the great opportunities from Luka, or you walk into some rebounds, the floor is probably not going to be massive.
Yeah, I don't think I really have a ton of interest in any of these guys. I think Kuzma's the most interesting, just because of Dinwiddie's absence. But a couple issues I have there are, number one, Dinwiddie is such a great facilitator, and they run so much through the pick and roll with him that I almost feel like Kuzma might benefit from Dinwiddie being on the floor. So I don't necessarily think his usage is going to get a boost from no Dinwiddie, especially if it ends up being Beal at point guard for a lot of the night instead of Neto or Holiday. So I don't love that. And then also Washington actually has the lowest opponent target score on the slate. If you look at my game environments chart, it's a pace down spot for them, and Dallas 12.4% turnover rate is extremely low. So it's just it's not attractive in that standpoint. I think maybe one of the guys in this range that I'm most interested in is actually Josh Hart at $5,800. Definitely not the type of game environment that I would like to play him in. He's another pace specialist, and this game projects as a 2-possession pace decline for them. But the minutes have been there, the usage has been there, and he's somebody who contributes in so many different categories that he can get there and really smash even without high usage. And that's always an attractive thing for a mid-price player.
And the point on Kuzma was really good because I've written about him a lot, and he's spotting up a lot for this team. And Dinwiddie helps out with that, getting him those looks. He's averaging he was averaging the last time I looked. He was like top 5. He's fallen off a little bit, but he's still averaging just over 5.2 spotted points per game. That's a top 15 number in the league, nearly a 40% frequency rate. So like, if he's not getting those looks as often as Dinwiddie, who's always been a facilitator dating back to his time with Brooklyn, that does hurt him a little bit. Josh Hart, Hart's interesting. The price is up, but he's one of the best rebounding wings in the league. So would it shock me if he walked into 8 rebounds? Not at all, especially with still no Zion there. We talked about Fournier and Burks. We talked about both Bridges. What do you think about? We didn't talk about some of the other players from Orlando, like Franz Wagner. His minutes have kind of been all over the place, but a little bit more consistent the last 2 games where he's been better in fantasy, right? 33 minutes, 31 almost 32 fantasy points, and then 29 minutes and just under 29 fantasy points for him at 4,500. Not the worst option, but you still don't feel totally safe about the minutes. And then below that, it's not great. I mentioned Cody Martin. I mean, Bruce Brown's going to be back with Harris out. Like, could that mean 25 to 27 minutes from him? He's missed the last 2 games of the hamstring injury, maybe, but that's not exactly something I'm going to trust either. I mean, does anybody for value stand out at small forward here?
Not really. I think you touched on the 2 names that I'd be most interested in Franz Wagner and Bruce Brown. But also, like you said, I'm not totally into either. I think this is a nice environment for Brown. The pace-up spot definitely does help him. but I just don't necessarily trust the minutes. And he's just such a low fantasy point per minute guy that I just feel like there are other spots in this slate that I like better.
All right, we got about a half hour until lock. Again, make sure you are taking advantage of the Black Friday deal promo going on at FTN right now. It ends this weekend, so you still have time. Use the promo code Black Friday to get 40% off any package over at FTN. Let's go to power forward. Again, Durant's there. Julius Randle, though, we've kind of talked about everybody but Julius Randle. Kind of alluded to him, but how do you not like this spot for him? I mean, we talk a lot about how he facilitates and brings the ball up, and I expect that to really continue in this game against Atlanta. So you have Randle at power forward. DeMar DeRozan is still only power forward eligible on DraftKings. He's been great this year, but I worry about him at 9K with Vucevic back. Who stands out to you at power forward? And we're getting some players back at the position, right? Mobley's back. We just got recently Markkanen and Kevin Love back for Cleveland. So Cleveland's front court is pretty much back to being full strength too.
Yeah, so I think this is a position where we can really highlight the fact that DraftKings is overpricing the studs, if you will. Like Durant at 10.8, that would sort of imply a fantasy points per game well over 50. He's at 47.9. Really don't love that. The peripheral stats just haven't been there for him. Randle, same idea. 10.2 would imply that he's right around 50. He's all the way down at 43. So even though I think he could get a boost here of some extra usage if he's getting some point guard time, I just don't like that price at all. You know, I think I so much prefer LaMelo, who's a little bit more appropriately priced and is in a fantastic spot. I do think this is a position that I want to go to value or Miles Bridges. There are a handful of guys. And actually, you know, we were just going over small forward and I completely forgot to mention it, but Lauri Markkanen at 5,600, I think is a really nice play. He's been getting some more small forward runs, so I'm not that concerned about the fact that Mobley's back. And like I talked about earlier, he's somebody as a shooter and a spot-up shooter that I think will really, really benefit from Garland and Rubio getting all the point guard time instead of Sexton. Just so many more potential assists out there, so many more shot attempts up for grabs, and that's his game.
Yeah, it's a really good call. Markkanen is like playing massive because we know Kevin Love is probably not going to play more than like 20 to 22 most games. And now with, you know, you have Mobley back. I don't know if Mobley's going to be limited. Like it was an elbow. It's not like it was a foot or a leg or something. And he only missed 4 games. So, but he doesn't have to be limited for Markkanen to still be, you know, well over 30 minutes or because he's playing small forward. That's the thing. Like it's not like it's not like when one's on the floor, the other one has to be off it because Markkanen has been starting at small forward and probably will again tonight. And like you said, he's getting those spot up looks and that benefits him playing with Rubio and Darius Garland. Kristaps Porzingis, it sounds weird to say it, but maybe for the first time in a while since he's been on Dallas, he's been really consistent and really good lately. I mean, 43, 42, 49, 48, 56, 47, 40 and a half fantasy points. He's been fantastic for Dallas. This matchup's not bad either. Washington allowing the third most post-up points per game on the season. Porzingis averaging 3.7 post-up points per game. That's 5th most in the league, so it's a pretty good spot. The question is, on a slate with, you know, some of the players you talked about, like, do you go 8,700 for Porzingis? It helps that he's, you know, only power forward eligible because like center is often always a loaded position too, so you don't have to really choose on DraftKings. But what do you think of Porzingis here? He's playing really well, which again, it's like you have to do a double take because since he's been on Dallas, it's been mostly underwhelming as of late.
Yeah, it's really interesting because not only are we surprised that he's playing so well, but he's been so incredibly consistent that at his price, he hasn't really had any ceiling games. He's had the 156.3 against Denver. Outside of that, he hasn't had a ceiling game at this price, even though he's consistently hit the price tag target. So I think with guys like Bridges, who I love the expectation and the ceiling, I'm just not interested in going up to Porzingis, who's shown a limited ceiling.
Yeah, it's totally fair. I tend to have like second and third and fourth thoughts with Porzingis. We got some news. Alec Burks will start for Kemba Walker. So he will be in the starting lineup for New York tonight. And the Nets starting 5 will be Harden, Mills, Bembry, Durant, Aldridge. So same 5 as it's been, even with Bruce Brown back. Suns starting their usual starting five, and then the Wizards will start Aaron Holiday at point guard like they did the last time. Then what he sat, so Holiday, Beal, KCP, Kuzma, Gafford. So how like still don't expect Holiday to get a lot of usage at the starting point guard because he can just quote unquote start at point guard. I feel like if you're going that low, I kind of asked you about it, and you weren't too high on the Wizards backcourt outside of Beal. I do think if you're playing one of the two, I feel like you still play Raul Neto.
Yeah, it's sort of a similar situation with Burks starting for New York. Like I kind of think that for both Burks and Holiday, the fact that they're in the starting lineup with guys who command usage night in, night out, it almost hurts them. Like it certainly, I think for Burks especially, helps the minutes projection, but I'm definitely concerned about their usage when they're on the floor. Like I love the fact that Quickly is going to have the second unit usage to himself, and I think that we'll probably still see him get up there in minutes. So I almost think that if Quickly's ownership drops because he's not starting, it makes me like him even more. And I do think Burks is a little bit more viable now, just because, like as we talked about, one of the concerns for him was that he might not play more minutes than usual, and you would think that starting means he will. But yeah, I'm definitely not interested in Holiday just because of the starting news, because I think that was very much the expectation for them. And again, I think I would trust Neto's usage on the second unit more.
Yeah, like Neto has a better chance of getting like 12 and 7 assists or something off the bench. So
Yeah.
Hawks, I was kind of going to get to them, so this works out. Hawks starting five: Trae Young, Bogdanovich, Kevin Huerter, John Collins, and Clint Capella. John Collins 6,900 on DraftKings. The reason I rarely play John Collins is because like I just play Capella if I'm playing that front court, because Capella it's like Rudy Gobert. It's like you're getting double-digit rebounds. It just depends on if he has an okay scoring night, if he scores like 8 real points, or if he can get up to like 17 to 20 and have the outlier kind of ceiling point scoring game. But Collins, like at under 7K, he kind of reminds me of like Jaren Jackson Jr. It's just a lot safer, right? Like he could pop off on any given night, but most of the time I feel like he's in that 30 to 36 range, which is fine. But again, if you're going to him, I think he's fine. Like, what do you think of Evan Mobley though? Because last time we saw Mobley, he was 0 for 11 from the field, then comes out, he hurt his elbow, hasn't played since. This will be his first game back. Prior to that, he was super solid for fantasy. 7 to 9 rebounds. The stocks were great, even walking into some 5 assist games for them. Mobley at 7K, I think if he's not limited and if he's good to go, probably be like 75, 7,600 by the time the Cavs next play. I think it's very possible.
Yeah, I think for starters, just to touch on John Collins for a second, I was playing a lot of him over the last like week or so, because we were starting to see them use him more at center in like second unit rotations. But Capella's playing so well that the trend we saw last game, Capella was at 17 minutes at halftime, which was well above what we usually see for him. So it almost seems like they're saying, Capella's playing so well that we need to give him. We need to really push his minutes, which is going to cut back on the Collins center minutes. So I don't love Collins as much as I have the past week. I do still think he's a nice play, but I'm also with you. Like, it feels like Capella's better for just $600 more. So unless you need the power forward spot instead of center, just get to Capella. I do like the Mobley call. And again, like I think Mobley's another guy who's going to benefit from Garland and Rubio. But I'd also say the last time we saw Mobley, I think Jared Allen was out, and so Mobley was the starting center. Going back to power forward, now Markkanen's back. Kevin Love is playing pretty well. I'm a little bit concerned. I do think he definitely has the ceiling that if he strings together a couple really nice games, just like you said, he'll be 7,500 plus. But I don't love him on this slate in his first game back.
Yeah, and that game you were talking about, November 15th against Boston, Jared Allen was out. So, yeah, Mobley started. That was the game. That was the stretch where it was like Allen was sick and I think Markkanen had just come back. Like, they were just depleted. Yeah. But they had been playing even when Sexton was there and everybody was healthy. They were playing the combination of Mobley and Allen so many minutes. Like, they were both playing like 36 minutes. So, if Mobley's not limited, I expect that again in this game. I mean, unless Cleveland runs away with it, which is possible. They're playing pretty well this year. Orlando's not good. But it's like, I expect 35, 36 minutes if this game's even somewhat competitive. So I think that does make Mobley interesting. On the other side of that game, you have Wendell Carter Jr. He's coming off a nice game against his former team. I feel like Wendell Carter Jr. and Mo Bamba are very similar to Jarrett Allen and Evan Mobley. Like they're both locked into very, very safe minutes. Probably not as high of minutes together as Mobley and Allen, but they're clearly the two guys in the front court. I think Carter Jr. at under 6K is interesting. Just given the fact that he's been relatively productive this year, I think it's a little cheap for him, but still at the same time, not by any means like is he a must play. What do you think of Wendell Carter Jr.? Then anybody else we mentioned, we failed to mention at power forward. We touched on Marketing, who's small forward and power forward eligible. Then it's tough because you have Kevin Love, who you can't play really. You mentioned Jayshawn Tate, and we mentioned Franz Wagner. And then you can't play Dean Wade with these guys back, obviously. I mean, PJ Washington's back, but can you trust that? He played 24 minutes last game, and we know Mason Plumlee's out. So power forward, it's another tough position for the most part, too.
Yeah, I think it's impossible not to like the way Carter Jr. projects if this game stays close. He was near the top in the player rater and value projections for Kyle, so I talked about him in my article today. And it's definitely not a great game environment for him. Like I said, Cleveland is surprisingly good defensively, and they're slow. So I don't love him. I think I prefer to pivot off of him since he's projecting for such high ownership. And Markkanen would be my favorite, or just going down to somebody like Mikhail Bridges, Alec, Burks, something like that. But if you want to play Carter Jr., if you feel like you're diversified enough in the rest of your lineup, I have absolutely no argument. He definitely projects well.
All right, let's move on to the center position, where at the top, again, Randall's center eligible, so he'll be up there. Rudy Gobert, Jonas Valanciunas in the same game, Nikola Vucevic, Bam Adebayo, Clint Capella. Who stands out to you at the top at center? We don't have, center's pretty loaded. I would say it's probably not as loaded as it usually is in this slate because there's no Jokic, there's no Towns. So we're missing some pretty huge stars at center, but still plenty of options.
Yeah, I almost feel like there's as much upside in the 7K range for centers as there is above them. So I definitely won't be paying more than in the sevens for a center. Two guys that stand out. We just talked about Capella, but the main one for me is Christian Wood, all the way down at 7,200. I mean, one of the first two guys I talked about in my article today was at the top of the player rater and projections for Kyle, and is also in the premier game environment on the slate. I mean, one thing I really like to look at is where Vegas has teams implied relative to what they score on a typical night. The Rockets are implied for 8 points above their average points per game this year. That's a huge number. We don't see numbers like that very often. Christian Wood is the focal point of the offense. He's been struggling a little bit, but if there's ever a matchup that's sort of perfect for him, it's not just the pace for Charlotte, but it's the fact that he has a size advantage in this game with Plumlee out. So I love Christian Wood at 7,200. He's a core play for me and definitely someone I have locked in.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Charlotte's been terrible against centers for years now. This year it's been no different. They allow, I think, like a 64% field goal percentage at the rim. It's the highest rate in the league. Christian Wood's going to get a ton of paint touches, a ton of work in this game. And again, they're a team that gets beat a lot, but when they're in games and when they're competitive, Christian Wood plays huge minutes. When you mentioned that you're kind of living that 7K range, I agree wholeheartedly. Like, you have Capella, you have Jarrett Allen, you have DeAndre Ayton, who's kind of interesting here because Brooklyn, you don't worry about Aldridge slowing him down at this stage of his career, and they also allow, I think, the most points per game off putback, so that bodes well for Ayton at 7,200. I love those three options. I'm fine with Jarrett Allen too. Like, it's such a good matchup for Rudy Gobert. He was underwhelming last game, but I feel like if there's one player, if a lot of other people have the same mindset as you, where it's just go to the 7K range at center, I think Gobert has like 18 and 20. I mean, he has 18 and 20 upside every game, but I still think a matchup against the Pelicans is so good. I just worry that, obviously, you worry that game stays close. Vucevic back in the lineup for Chicago the last two games. He's kind of been right around where he's been since last year, right? It's like, with Orlando, he was like, okay, anywhere between like 45 and 60 most nights. And now it's kind of like anywhere between 35 and 42, which just hard to pay 8,500 for him when I think Wood has a higher ceiling, like you mentioned. Capella's got similar floor, close ceiling. So it's going to be tough for me to get to Vucevic, I think.
Yeah, I'm so confused about the pricing for these Bulls. Every single night, like DeRozan, Levine, and Vucevic carry no ownership. They are averaging well under the fantasy points per game that their prices would imply, and yet their prices don't move. So I find myself never playing any of those three. The only bull that I've played is Lonzo, and that's very game environment specific. So just a complete avoid for me, especially in a matchup with Miami.
Looking elsewhere, I mentioned, like so Wood's definitely your favorite of this. I guess at any price at center, right? I would imagine.
Yeah.
What about if you were ranking some of the other centers around him, like DeAndre Ayton, Clint Capella, Jared Allen? Like, how do you view those players? Mo Bamba is a little bit cheaper than that. I believe he's probable and available to play. With Bamba, for me, it's kind of like the same or the opposite of what we talked about with the Atlanta front court. Like, Bamba is always more expensive than Wendell Carter Jr., and I tend to lean Wendell Carter Jr. And then for Atlanta, Capella is always more expensive than Collins, but I'd still rather play Capella.
Yeah, I think Ayton would probably be my second favorite. I really do love this matchup for him, especially if Brooklyn needs more offense and goes to Aldridge. I think that's a huge mismatch for Ayton. Honestly, like I don't think it really matters who's on the floor for Brooklyn at center. It's a nice spot for Ayton. All these guys are viable though. Capella, Allen. I think Allen probably does take a small hit with Mobley back, so I think I'd avoid those two. And yeah, I'm with you now. I think I do prefer Carter Jr. to Bamba. Maybe there's some leverage going Bamba instead of Carter Jr. And I would say, like, early in the season, I thought it was going to be Bamba who really took the step forward and had the price that was going to rise into the mid sevens, maybe even low eights. And he just hasn't shown the upside that he showed a couple times early on in the season. I think he had a few 50 plus point DraftKings outings and hasn't really come close to that since. And I think we're going to see Carter Jr. more expensive than him sooner than later.
You mentioned Aldridge. I mean, he had the double-double against Cleveland, and then he got his first start of the season against Boston in their last game. And, I mean, he's been pretty solid. I mean, 30, 23, 34, and 29 minutes his last four. He's been at 38 fantasy points, just under 25, over 38, and nearly 34. The price is not, like, incredible. It's fine. But if this is a trend for Brooklyn where they're going to continue to just let him play 27 to 30 minutes because, again, they're a team that clearly doesn't have the most, viable front court, still no Nicholas Claxton for Brooklyn. Like, I mean, Aldridge might still be in play here. We know he's, even with Durant and Harden on the floor with him, he's still getting up more than enough shots, and the rebounds have been pretty solid too. Obviously, he's not the same player he was with Portland or anything like that, but I think he's viable. My problem is, like, I think there's a higher ceiling for Wendell Carter Jr. and they're priced very closely to each other. But if I landed on Aldridge in this spot, I wouldn't be too against it.
Yeah, so I've got a couple thoughts here. In my article, I talked about the fact that Aldridge is at 1.16 fantasy points per minute this year. That's awesome. But I actually feel like he's one of the guys in the league who doesn't do as well in pace. Most guys, pace helps. And I think Aldridge is somebody who wants a slower game. So I worry that if it's a pace-up spot, which we believe it is, like, is that going to mean that they can't play him as many minutes as they'd like to? And then the other concern I have is, we talked about this earlier for a little bit, which is the fact that center is almost always loaded. And so when you've got guys who project similarly, but some have power forward eligibility, I typically lean them. And that's the case tonight. Like, Aldridge is around, Carter Jr., Markkanen, guys who I think project extremely similarly to him, including in ownership. Like, I think Aldridge will be less than Carter Jr., but Markkanen will probably be even less than Aldridge. And I'd rather play Markkanen at small forward or power forward than Aldridge at center.
Got about 10 minutes left. We'll go through the rest of the center position, and then we will get out of here. Looking at the Opto about 10 minutes ago or so, and two names at center that were kind of popping were PJ Washington, 4,400 on DraftKings, with obviously Mason Plumlee out. And Mitchell Robinson, I believe, is up there. I mean, look, 4,100 for Mitchell Robinson. We've seen the ceiling he can present in fantasy with rebounds and blocks. And you have Gibson and Nerlens Noel out. And even with Kemba out and Rose out, it's not like Robinson's going to suddenly become a high usage player. He's still going to be like under 10% usage if I had to guess in this game. but he also has a 30% rebounding rate with both those front court players off the floor. He's only 4,100. He has a path to get to 30 minutes in this game, especially against an Atlanta front court that's going to have size no matter what. So they'll need Robinson. And even if he only plays 25 to 27, like that could still be enough for Mitchell Robinson to double-double in this game or get, 10 rebounds. And like this is a nice shot blocking spot for Robinson because Trae Young is everybody talks about his three-point shooting and stuff. But the last couple of years, he's been among the league leaders in drives per game. And that presents shot blocking opportunities for Mitchell Robinson.
Yeah, it does. I didn't need to have a tougher last choice because involved in my last 2v2 is Daniel Gafford at 4,100, and now it's like, oh man, now I got to choose between Gafford and Robinson as well.
And he was the third player I was going to mention too because I've talked about Robinson. First of all, you're not getting 8 blocks again. I'll just say that. If you do, congratulations. But still, if he can get to that 26-minute mark, he's been mostly productive.
He's over a fantasy point per minute. So I do think I would definitely say that I prefer both Robinson and Gafford to PJ Washington. Not necessarily just from a raw 1v1 perspective, but because I'm already playing LaMelo and probably already playing Bridges as well. I don't necessarily want another guy, especially because Washington, if he's on the floor, he's competing for usage with those guys and competing for those same rebounds that are really tied to the upside and ceiling outcomes for both Bridges and LaMelo. So I wouldn't like the correlation of all three of them together, even though I love the correlation of LaMelo and Bridges together. So definitely prefer Robinson and Gafford there. But it's such a tough decision between the two. I honestly have no idea which way I'd go.
Yeah, it's tough because I feel like if just one of Noel or Gibson were in, it might be enough to be like, okay, I think I'll go with why am I blanking on who? Gafford.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that they're both out and they're facing an Atlanta team that's going to have Capella and or Collins on the floor for most of this game, it's enough to make you like really have a tough time deciding. I would probably lean Robinson, but man, and that's tough because like I said, I've talked about Gafford on this show before. But if that's where you're going, if you're going down this range at center for cheap, right? You're not going anywhere other than that. I mean, Maxi Kleber's coming off a huge game in terms of minutes, but obviously that game went to overtime. I mean, he did have a larger role with Brunson getting hurt in that game. Maybe Kleber wouldn't be the worst option. I think he's actually high up there in the opto as well. I think Willie Cauley-Stein's going to start again for Dallas, but he'll probably play like 15 to 16 minutes. Maybe you go to Kleber if you're going that low, but I think I still prefer the guys we just talked about.
Yeah, I definitely prefer their value. I think one other thing that's worth mentioning before we get out of here is
did you just see the news?
Out. Yeah, Bamba out. It makes it really, really difficult to not play Carter Jr. I almost feel like the only way that Carter Jr. doesn't hit at this price is if they get blown out, which Bamba being out does increase that chance. But I don't know. It's another one of those decisions that I just want no part of.
Does this also help? I talked about how Franz Wagner's minutes have been up and down, but if Carter Jr. has to slide up to the 5, this team's shorthanded, right? They're more shorthanded at guard than anywhere else, but it's there's only so many players. Obviously, I think Terrence Ross gets a bump too if you want to go there, but obviously no Cole Anthony, still no Fultz, no Carter Williams. Robin Lopez will start. I don't think you have to go there. I guess you can. Should we talk about Robin Lopez real quick? Because again, it's a Cleveland team that's got so much size. Maybe they'll have to play him more minutes than they would have liked to, but he was already playing 12, 13 minutes a game off the bench, and now he could get up to 22 at minimum salary.
Yeah, I actually like that a decent amount. I guess I would say it depends what that gets you, because there's definitely the possibility it doesn't get you a whole lot going down there.
If you're pairing Durant and LaMelo or something, or if you're trying to fit in 2 10K players or something, maybe that's the route you go.
Yeah, that's exactly how I put it too.
Okay, that's interesting though with Bamba. I agree. It's hard not to go to Wendell Carter Jr. I mean, with Bamba off the floor this season, Carter Jr. has a 33% rebounding rate, 1.13 fantasy points per minute. So he's the obvious, beneficiary, but I still think you can feel a little bit better about Franz Wagner, who would probably still play in a blowout, honestly. for the Orlando Magic. So again, Mo Bamba out. If he was in your lineup, get him out. He is not playing for the Orlando Magic tonight. And I think that'll just about do it for us. We got about 5 minutes until lock. Again, check out the promo we have at FTN right now. Black Friday is the promo code. You get 40% off any package at FTN. It ends this weekend, so you still have some time left to get a part of that. Alex, man, this is fun. Fun show. Good to talk to you for the first time on the show. Got NFL tomorrow. Anything you want to plug at FTN before we get out of here?
And not really. Check out my NFL content. I got a really nice GPP stacks and correlated leverage article that I love writing every week. But yeah, let's get it tonight. Really fun show.
Yeah, absolutely. Have a great rest of your weekend, everybody. Best of luck in NBA DFS here on Saturday night, and we will talk to you next time. Peace out.